Let's talk about a world where your entire life, I mean everything, was decided the second you were born. Not by your choices, but by sheer luck. That was the reality for people in the Middle Ages, and we're about to dive right into it.
So, just for a second, picture it. If you were dropped into that world, who would you be? Would you be living it up in a giant castle or trying to stay warm in a little hut? Well, that all came down to one thing: the family you were born into.
You see, in this world, there were pretty much two main paths you could go down. On one side, you've got the life of a lord, a life of privilege, power, and, well, comfort. And on the other side, the life of a serf, which meant a life of hard labor, total obedience, and constant hardship. It was basically the ultimate birth lottery, and the stakes couldn't have been higher.
To really get what this was like, we're going to look at this tale of two completely different lives, starting right from the beginning, with what it was like to grow up.
Okay, so if you hit the jackpot and were born to a lord or a lady, your life was pretty sweet. You had all the food you could eat, servants taking care of everything, and you even got to learn how to read and write, which was super rare back then. If you were a boy, you'd be training to be a knight, learning how to fight with a sword. If you were a girl, you'd be learning stuff like embroidery and music. Your future was set. You were born to rule.
But here's the thing you have to remember. That life of privilege, that was for a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. For pretty much everyone else, the vast majority, life was a whole different story. They were serfs.
So what exactly is a serf? Well, think of a farm worker who was quite literally tied to the land they worked on. They couldn't just pack up and leave. They were the absolute bottom of the social ladder, holding the whole system up, but with basically zero power of their own.
And this huge difference in status showed up in, their actual physical world. So let's look at the incredible contrast in their day-to-day lives, from where they slept to what they ate.
I mean, talk about night and day. A lord lived in a huge castle or a manor house with tons of rooms and servants. A serf's entire family, on the other hand, was crammed into one tiny single-room hut made of wood and mud. They slept on straw, and the only chimney they had was a hole in the roof to let the smoke out.
And food, oh boy. While the lords are having these big feasts with roasted meats and spices and wine, a serf's diet was, well, it was boring and basic. For breakfast, you might have some rye bread and some really watery ale. For lunch, more rye bread, maybe with a little bit of cheese. And dinner was usually this thin vegetable stew they called pottage. And that was it, day after day after day.
So how did the lord afford his lavish lifestyle? Simple. The whole economy was built on the backs of the serfs. They had to work the lord's land for free for about half their time. They paid taxes with their crops, their animals, even cash. Heck, just to grind their own grain into flour, they had to pay the lord a fee to use his mill. The whole system was designed to just funnel wealth straight to the top.
This gets us to how people even thought about time. For a lord, time was all about seasons for hunting or politics. But for a serf, time was just one long, endless cycle of backbreaking work.
A serf's job was never, ever done. Spring was for plowing the fields and planting. All summer long, they were out there weeding and keeping birds away from the crops. Autumn was the big rush for the harvest, cutting down all the grain by hand with a scythe. And even in the middle of winter, there were always fences and tools to fix and animals to take care of. It was relentless, all dictated by the sun and the seasons.
And with so little money to go around, you can bet every coin was a big deal. Actually, here's a fun little fact for you. People used to save their coins in these little pots made from a type of orange clay called pig. And over time, pig pot morphed into what we now call a piggy bank. Pretty cool, huh?
Okay, so we've seen the difference in money and in work. But the deepest, most profound difference, that came down to power and freedom. Let's dig into the rules that completely controlled their lives.
The lord's power was just about absolute. He owned everything, the land, the villages, you name it. The serf's life, in contrast, was just a list of things they couldn't do. They couldn't leave the land without getting permission. They needed a lord's okay just to get married. They weren't allowed to hunt in the lord's forest, even if their family was starving. And the kicker? Their children were born into the exact same life.
Now, it wasn't quite that black and white. There was another group out in the country called freemen. They were still farmers, but they weren't under the lord's thumb in the same way. They had a little more freedom, which created this sort of small middle ground.
Which of course brings up the million-dollar question, right? Was there any way out? Could a serf, born into this life, ever hope to become free? And the answer is yes. But man, it was a huge risk. There was this one rule. If a serf managed to run away to a town and live there for a year and a day without getting caught, they were legally considered a free person. It was a massive gamble, but for some, it was the only shot they had at a different life.
So you have to wonder, why did this incredibly unfair system last for hundreds of years? Why did people put up with it? Well, the answer comes down to the basic deal at the heart of it all: loyalty in exchange for protection.
You have to remember, this was a seriously dangerous time to be alive. Wars and raids were happening constantly. For the average person, safety wasn't a given. It was the most valuable thing in the world.
This constant need for safety created this really rigid chain of command. At the bottom, you had the serfs, who were loyal to their lord. That lord was then loyal to a more powerful noble above him, and that noble was loyal all the way up to the king. It was this whole pyramid built for one reason: defense.
And that's the trade-off, right there. In exchange for all their work, all their taxes, all their freedom, and their complete loyalty, the Lord promised his people one thing: protection. When an enemy army came marching through, the serfs could run inside the walls of the Lord's castle for safety. They gave up freedom for security.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. In a world that was so violent and so uncertain, was trading your freedom for protection a fair deal? It's the central problem of that whole era, and it's definitely something worth mulling over.